Imagine 7,000 men trapped in a killing field with no escape. Dust suffocates the air as dying men's cries echo across the battlefield as the merciless sun beats down upon them, illuminating a brutal spectacle. On August 2nd, 216 BCE, the armies of Rome and Carthage clashed in perhaps history's most spectacular military victory. In a single afternoon, Hannibal Barca orchestrated the slaughter of more Roman legionnaires than the United States lost during the entire Vietnam War. For over 2 millennia, military academies studied Cannae as the perfect example of the deadly triple envelopment. Generals from Napoleon to Schwarzkopf have attempted to replicate this masterpiece, but few have succeeded. But quite beyond its strategic brilliance, Hannibal's trap resulted in one of military history's most bloody days, perhaps not equaled until the Somme in 1916. The following is what happens when 70,000 men are completely encircled with nowhere to hide or flee. On the field at Cannae, 2 men who couldn't have been more different were in command of Rome's largest armies to date. Aristocratic Lucius Aemilius Pallas brought the measured caution of a seasoned military veteran. Having earned his reputation fighting Illyrian pirates, Pallas recognized the dangers of Hannibal's tactical genius and advocated patience, a quality Rome desperately needed but politically couldn't afford. Opposite of him was Terentius Varro, a butcher's son. He had risen through Roman society through populist appeal. Bold, aggressive, and hungry for glory, Varro had secured Senate support by promising a swift defeat of the Carthaginian invaders. His reckless confidence was matched only by his battlefield inexperience. Facing them was Hannibal Barca, who had unbelievably dared to cross the Alps, attacking Rome's heartland from its vulnerable northern flank. He spent 2 years ravaging Roman farms and destroying any armies that dared oppose him on the open field. The Carthaginians exploited the terror the Romans had of the Gauls and employed them heavily within his force. Their wild, spiked hair and colossal stature intimidated the Romans, and Hannibal, a master of psychological warfare, placed them in his center. Opposing him, Rome brought to the field of Cannae the most powerful military machine the ancient world had ever seen. 2 giant consular armies were deployed comprising of 8 double-strength legions plus allied Italian troops. Seeking to annihilate Hannibal once and for all, the Senate had emptied the city's reserves and assembled a host of 80,000 men. These legions were arranged in depth and, like a battering ram, were supposed to smash through Hannibal's Gallic center. In its ranks were professional killers. Each Roman legionary wielded uniform equipment, with the short but lethal gladius sword worn at their sides, rectangular scudam shields in their left hand, the sun glinting off the bronze and iron. Trained to fight in the flexible manipular system that had conquered the Italian peninsula, they moved inexorably forward as one single organism. Their weakness? A mere 6,000 cavalry, a mere afterthought in Rome's infantry-dominated doctrine. Facing this juggernaut was Hannibal's patchwork army of 40,000 troops, half Rome's size but twice as adaptable, seasoned veterans all. Guarding the flank of the wild-haired Gallic warriors wielding slashing longswords stood Hannibal's heavy Libyan spearmen. They were equipped with Roman gear borrowed from earlier victories. Spanish troops in distinctive white tunics with deadly falcata swords mixed with slingers and skirmishers from a dozen territories made up his light infantry skirmishers. But Hannibal's true advantage lay in his superb corps of 10,000 plus cavalry. Heavy Gallic and Spanish horsemen comprised the wings, and the nimble Numidian light cavalry, who could ride without saddles or bridles, accompanied the light infantry. Where Rome's force was homogeneous and predictable, Hannibal's was adaptable and flexible. The Carthaginians' genius was the glue that held a multilingual, multinational force together, and they obeyed his every word. He was the conductor of Cannae's deadly symphony. 2 devastating defeats shadowed the Roman camp. First, at Trivia, thousands of legionnaires died frozen in the river fleeing Hannibal's ambush. Then, a similar catastrophe at Lake Trasimene, where an entire Roman army blindly marched into Hannibal's trap and was badly mauled. Meanwhile, however, Hannibal faced his own dilemma. Deep in enemy territory with tenuous supply lines, his army survived by raiding Italian farmlands. Time was not on his side, and he knew it. He needed a decisive victory with which to force a peace, or at the very least convince Rome's wavering Latin allies to come to his side. Unless he could force a battle every day, his strategic position deteriorated further. Luckily for him, the Romans obliged and met him on the field. Hannibal chose the field of Cannae deliberately. He selected terrain that neutralized Rome's numerical advantage by limiting their deployment, positioning his army with the Aufidus River protecting one flank and the rising sun behind him to blind the Romans. As the Roman juggernaut swept across the plain, they faced what appeared to be conventional Carthaginian line, but it was here that Hannibal had created an elaborate trap. His center bulged outward in a provocative convex formation. This central bulge, comprised mainly of his Gallic and Spanish troops, was deliberately weakened. What appeared to the aggressive Romans as the weak point in Carthage's lines was really the bat in Hannibal's trap. This ostensibly weak center, upon which the heaviest Roman blows were expected, was commanded by Hannibal in person, where his presence steeled the resolve of the tribal warbands. Ensnaring the legions was their own momentum carried them forward. On both wings, his elite African infantry waited for the right moment. Positioned in depth and echelon instead of the expected wide front, coiled like vipers, these troops were the jaws of the trap that were to swing shut at the command of their chief. Though outnumbered in infantry, Hannibal's cavalry was his edge. On his left flank were the swift Numidians, commanded by Hannibal the Resolute. His objective was to use his speed and flexibility to pin down and outmaneuver the Roman light infantry and cavalry to his front. On Hannibal's right flank, Hanno the Intrepid led the heavy Spanish and Gallic horsemen. He was to sweep the inferior Roman cavalry from the field and, together with Hannibal, were to cut off the Roman retreat as the trap swung shut. As the first light of dawn stretched across the darkened sky, the Roman advance began with military precision. The young and eager Hastati led the way, followed by the more armored Principes and the Triarii holding the rear. The ground trembled beneath 80,000 pairs of hobnailed sandals moving in unison to the sound of trumpets and the shouts of centurions. Confidence radiated from their ranks. Here was Rome's might incarnate, a veritable, seemingly unstoppable human battering ram. Consul Vero, opting for depth, deployed his legions defensively, forming a thick aimed right at Hannibal's center. The Roman Hastati clashed with the Gauls in the center, pushing them back by sheer weight of numbers. The short, stabbing gladius made quick work of the unarmored but determined Gauls. Hannibal, in the thick of combat leading from the front, barely held on, but it was then he sprung his trap. The Romans were oblivious to the disaster materializing with stunning speed on their flanks. Hannibal's superior cavalry, after a fierce but short combat, routed the Roman cavalry. The Gallic and Spanish heavy horse on Hannibal's right wing not only outclassed, but utterly destroyed, massacred their Roman counterparts. After a desperate but hopeless fight, a wild, merciless melee of men and horses, the Roman allied cavalry broke in panic. Roman cavalrymen became fugitives, hunted down for sport by the pitiless Gauls, but the Romans still had faith in their infantry. The Roman army continued advancing and found surprising success. Hannibal's protruding center began giving way, pushed back by Roman steel and resolve. Sensing victory, the Romans advanced forward, but as they did so, their formations and battle order deteriorated. By the time the first Romans sensed something seriously wrong, it was already too late. The trap was all but closed. When the moment came, the pivot executed with lethal precision. Like the closing doors of a massive vault, Hannibal's elite African infantry, hitherto waiting quietly on both flanks, suddenly wheeled inward. These veterans rotated 90 degrees, a most adept maneuver only seasoned troops can execute, and collapsed as one on the Romans' exposed flanks. Before they could even turn to register, let alone meet this new threat, the legionnaires on the flanks were fighting for their lives. Men who moments before had been advancing confidently now desperately tried to reorient their shields against attacks coming from multiple unexpected directions. Then came the hammer blow. After defeating the Roman cavalry, Hannibal's horsemen returned to the battlefield with one deadly purpose. The sound of hooves announced their approach as hundreds of Numidian, Spanish, and Gallic riders crashed into the exposed Roman rear. The first Romans inside the closing pocket to realize their situation were the officers. Centurions and legates who had survived Trebia and Trasimene, the elite of Roman society, recognized at last that they were inside Hannibal's trap and there was no way out. Their warning shouts became shrieks of terror as lost the confusion and panic grabbed a hold of men. One by one, the legionnaires of the Roman center, still methodically moving forward, began to sense that they were advancing in the wrong direction. The psychological impact was immediate and severe. Roman soldiers trained to fight to their front suddenly faced enemies everywhere. The impossible was happening. Rome's largest army was surrounded by a smaller, deadlier one. Men in the rear ranks turned to face the horsemen, exposing the flanks and rear of the Roman center, creating chaos as the maniples lost all cohesion. Command and control utterly collapsed. Slowly, the legionnaires realized to their horror there was nowhere to run. There was no line to reform. There were no reinforcements coming. Death was closing in from all sides, and steadily. As this realization spread, discipline began to collapse. Some dropped their weapons in shock, others froze in terror, while yet others fought with newfound desperation. Hannibal had done the impossible. He had trapped the larger Roman force and used their aggressiveness against them. He had beaten them tactically as well as psychologically. The Roman deep deployment, once a symbol of disciplined Rome's martial might, became yet another tool in the creation of history's deadliest trap. Within it, the Carthaginian forces enveloped 8 whole legions. Now they were being devoured alive. The Romans in the center found themselves packed so tightly that their shields were pressed against their bodies. The very few veterans who somehow managed to survive described how their maniples, designed for flexibility and mutual protection, transformed into an instrument of torture. The trapped legionnaires could no longer raise their arms to strike or defend themselves. Their gladi, the short swords that had conquered much of the Mediterranean, hung uselessly at their sides, as their panicked brethren endeavored in futility to move away from Carthaginian sword and spear. As the pressure intensified, men in the interior ranks began to die of asphyxiation without ever facing an enemy blade. They suffocated, crushed by the weight of their own comrades, blinded by dust, deafened by screams, constricted to death like the prey of an anaconda. There was not even room to fall. Survivors remembered the horrifying sight of dead men remaining upright, held in place by the press of bodies around them. For the legionnaires, that day on August 2nd, 216 BCE was literally hell on earth. Perhaps the lucky ones were the Romans on the flanks. They did not meet their end crushed by their own comrades. Here the Libyan spearmen dispatched them with spear blows to the face and to the neck. For miles around that deadly field in southern Italy, one could hear the sound of battle carried by swift summer winds. The gasps for air, the cracking of ribs, sword on shield, spear on flesh, were heard distinctly by villagers miles away. But to those present, the victorious as well as the vanquished, it was the acrid smell of sweat and fear mixed with the copper scent of blood being spilled that most assaulted their senses. What was once a Roman army was now nothing but helpless mass fugitives, panic-stricken and defenseless. It was here when Hannibal initiated the next phase, the slaughter. Though the Carthaginians set about this final act with the same tactical precision that had characterized their maneuvers, it was nothing resembling a battle. Now this was just an execution. The Carthaginian infantry began working methodically from the outer edges of the Roman formation inward. Row by row, they cut down the immobilized legionnaires who could neither fight back effectively nor flee. The killers would advance a few paces, dispatch the Romans before them with well-aimed spear blows to the face and neck, move forward to the next rank, grow weary, catch their breath, then start the process all over again. Even for hardened warriors, the task proved physically and psychologically exhausting. Contemporary accounts describe how Hannibal was forced to rotate fresh troops into the killing lines as men became too tired to lift their arms after hours of continuous slaughter. Some Carthaginian soldiers reportedly collapsed from exhaustion, their arms so fatigued from repeated killing strokes that they could no longer wield their weapons. Amid this organized butchery, individual dramas of desperation and heroism played out. Some Roman centurions, recognizing the hopelessness of their situation, organized small groups in futile last stands. Others threw down their weapons in surrender, though few were taken prisoner. Witnesses described Roman soldiers who, seeing no escape, fell upon their own swords rather than await the approaching Carthaginian blades. Most haunting were the accounts of Romans who, in their final moments, dug shallow holes with bare hands to hide their faces or bury their heads in the blood-soaked dirt. When the sun set on the plain of Cannae, the scale of Rome's defeat was unprecedented. Over 60,000 Roman and allied soldiers lay dead. This was all that was left of 8 full legions. The battlefield was a morass of butchered corpses and crimson soil. Carthaginian losses numbered fewer than 6,000 men, mostly in the hard-fought center. Consul Lucius Aemilius Pallas, who had counseled caution before the battle, died fighting along his men, his body later identified among the heaps of slain. His co-consul, Gaius Tyrrhenius Varro, who had pushed for engagement, escaped with a small cavalry contingent to nearby Venusia, where he began organizing the scattered survivors. In Rome, the news triggered near panic. The Senate enacted emergency measures forbidding public mourning lest it further damage morale. They appointed a dictator, armed slaves, recalled exiles, and even resorted to human sacrifice, a practice long abandoned, to appease the gods. Young boys and old men were pressed into service to defend the city walls. Yet Hannibal, despite his overwhelming victory, did not march on Rome. His general Hannibal famously lamented, "You know how to win a victory, Hannibal, but not how to use it." Whether due to logistics, strategy, or a misreading of Roman resolve, this decision would prove fatal. Cannae's legacy in military history was immediate and enduring. For centuries afterwards, commanders studied the battle as the perfect example of envelopment tactics. The double envelopment became known simply as the Cannae maneuver, a template for decisive victory that military strategists from Scipio Africanus to Moltke the Younger would attempt to replicate with varying levels of success. Cannae can be understood as a testament to what military genius can accomplish as well as what it cannot, but often forgotten are the depths of human suffering. Of all the warriors that trudged that hollow field, most left this life amidst unimaginable horror, a horror inflicted masterfully by one man, Hannibal Barca, Rome's greatest nemesis. If you like this sort of content and want to see more, please like and subscribe.